Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, episode 36 of the 2020 podcast series, getting you ready for the NFL Draft. We're just days away, April 23rd, all virtual NFL Draft, first of its kind. Again, yes, it's going to be a lot like your online fantasy football draft. We've already had some technical difficulties. The league ran kind of a mock draft. They already ran into some issues there. We know that there are going to, be those potential, technical difficulties. If you've ever been on a Skype or a Zoom call, you know that that's bound to happen. Hopefully these teams will be able to figure out where the mute button is as well, especially if they're having some of those conversations. You don't want to necessarily forget about that mute button and have a conversation that you don't want someone to overhear. So, when we look at this draft, it's so funny how we get so close to the draft itself and suddenly the rumors start coming out. The rumor mill. The latest is that now Kansas City may be trading up for Henry Ruggs. It seems like everybody's making a play for Henry Ruggs. The San Francisco 49ers are going to make a play. Denver's going to trade up to get him. All these different teams supposedly targeting Henry Ruggs. The more and more we look at this, Henry Ruggs could end up being the number one wide receiver taken in the draft. When you got a guy who's running a 4.27 40, you've seen what Tyreek Hill has meant to KC with that explosive speed on the outside. And for as dominant as CeeDee Lamb can be there at OU and Jerry Jeudy being the consistent playmaker with the route running ability and some of that explosiveness, you can't teach that 4.27 40. And that sub 4.3 speed coupled with the 42-inch vertical leap, a guy that makes plays down the field, a touchdown every 4.08 receptions, a guy who just makes plays down the football field, also able to take a screen or a quick pass and turn it into a big play. Marquise Brown, not everyone was expecting him to be the number one wide receiver taken in the draft. Look what happened. He ended up going number 15 overall to the Ravens. And I think if you're ultimately talking about Henry Ruggs being the number one receiver, he's going to have to come off the board, probably in the top 10 because, I think you're going to have to see someone more than likely trade up to get him. I think the Jets have talked about, they've said that the Jets are talking about and the Raiders are talking about and the 49ers. So that's 11, 12, and 13. I still have him going to the Broncos. Reason being, I look at Drew Lock, and I've said this before, when he was at Mizzou, he had a guy by the name of Emmanuel Hall. When Emmanuel Hall was healthy, this is a guy who he couldn't stay healthy. But when he was healthy, he was a threat on the outside, a guy that just got vertical. And whenever Drew Lock needed a big play, that's where he went. That was his security blanket. He loved to be able to drop the ball in. I mean, he threw that deep ball with accuracy, the touch, allowed Hall to run underneath the ball, make a play in stride, and get down the football field. I'm looking at Henry Ruggs. That's what they're missing in Denver. And Ruggs can be that guy. And so that's one of the things that I'm looking at there. I would absolutely say that it makes a ton of sense for us to pencil in Henry Ruggs there to Denver. Again, I said pencil in. We're not going to go ahead and put it in ink or anything like that. I'm not guaranteeing that that's going to happen. There are a lot of other teams that could potentially trade up and get Henry Ruggs at they're. The Jets sitting there at number 11. Look, if the Browns stay put, they get their offensive tackle at 10, then you can potentially see, they're at 11, Henry Ruggs going to the Jets. The Jets need speed at the receiver position. They don't have speed. They've got Quincy Enunwa. They've got, Jamison Crowder. They have Josh Doxson, Brashad Perriman. None of those guys are going to be the blazing speedsters that Henry Ruggs would be. So it's going to be interesting to see exactly how all of that plays out. So what we've been doing the last couple of podcasts has really been taking a look at the draft classes by position and really talking about the stock of some of the players and where I see them coming off the board, what round, and for some even talking about what team I see them going to. And we've done all of the offense. So we started off quarterbacks and running backs. We looked at receivers and tight ends. And then last podcast, we talked about the entire offensive line. So what we're going to do with this podcast is we're going to jump in, take a look at the defensive front, both the defensive ends and defensive tackles. I'm going to get through at least the first 2 days of the linebacker position as well, which will set up for next podcast, which I'm going to go ahead and record tomorrow. That'll be a podcast that's going to be dedicated to the remainder of that linebacker class, day 3, along with the secondary, both the corners and the safeties. So a lot to cover here. There are a lot of defensive ends, D tackles, often and linebackers that we got to discuss. So we're going to go ahead and jump into things right away. And looking at the defensive end position, obviously you've got Chase Young sitting there with the number 2 overall pick. This guy is a game wrecker. I don't care what you say about him. Even when he wasn't getting home and filling the stat sheets, I heard Mel Kiper Jr. getting on him about the fact that he didn't register a sack or multiple sacks in a game the last 3 games of the season. But here's the deal. And here's where I would disagree with Mel on this, is he was still just as effective in those last 3 games, against Michigan in the Big Ten Championship, against Wisconsin, and then in the Fiesta Bowl against Clemson. What I saw, on one play, Chase Young driving Jalen Mayfield, the right tackle, back off the ball, quickly disengaging, chasing Shea Patterson from the pocket. Later one with really quick hands against John Runyon on the other side. Gets a quick hit on Shea Patterson as he's throwing the ball down the field. In the Big Ten Championship, beat the left tackle Cole Van Lanen off the edge, actually hit the arm of quarterback Jack Cohn, ball popped up in the air. And then in the college football playoff semifinal, Young had his way with Tremaine Ankrum, the right tackle, the undersized right tackle. He's only 6'2", kept his balance on a cut block, able to flatten out, pressure Trevor Lawrence from behind on one play, then beating Ankrum inside on an option play, held his ground and contained Trevor Lawrence before throwing him down for no gain. So yes, he didn't get any, he didn't rack up the sacks, but those were just a couple of plays, and that was really what you saw, play in and play out with Chase Young, was being able to affect the play. You don't have to necessarily be the guy that's going to fill up the stat sheet every single game, though, it seemed like everyone was expecting that from Chase Young. And to that point, he had been doing that. He did get suspended for the 2 games, and, let's not dwell on that too much. He ultimately paid that back. It was so that his girlfriend could go to the 2018 Rose Bowl, paid a family friend, paid the family friend back. And so he only got suspended for the 2 games. And when he came back, it was those last 3 games. And that's really where you didn't always see the level of production that I think everyone was expecting him to play, to showcase. But look, 21 tackles for loss, 16 and a half sacks, a guy that, was a game wrecker. That's why he was the 4th, finished 4th in the Heisman, absolutely dominant. Teams had to know where this guy was lining up on the field. He's known for his explosive first step quickness, allows him to beat the blockers out of their stance, but really his hands allow him to be elite. Joey and Nick Bosa were always known for their exceptional handwork, while with the Buckeyes, and Young, no different. Combination of the club, the swipe, the rip moves to quickly disengage from the offensive tackle, tremendous power in his hands to attack the chest of the offensive tackle, get the blocker off balance, drive him into the backfield. Once he wins with his hands, the flexibility allows him to quickly turn the corner, dip in that inside shoulder, getting under the offensive tackle's pad level, hug in the corner. I mean, that's one of the things that you really saw. He flipped his hips, hug in the corner, and get flattened out to the quarterback. So quick to get around that corner. I mean, it was ridiculous. Also attacking the quarterback with an inside rush, whether it's setting up the offensive tackle to the outside before quickly planning and crossing the face of the blocker to quickly loop, or he'll quickly loop around and get in on a stunt. When he arrives at the quarterback, he's not just looking for a sack. He's looking to change the complexion of the game by attacking the quarterback's arm and swiping the ball free, as evidenced by the FBS leading 7 forced fumbles. I mean, this guy was just, you had to know where he was on the field at all times, because he was coming with bad intentions, and he was very difficult to block. And we don't even talk about his ability to get his hand into passing lanes. Had 8 career pass breakups, one of which came against Penn State in 2018, where he read a throw to the tight end in the flat after coming in motion, showed the ability to get his hand up on that quick throw and make a play on the football. Had to make a quick move, got his hand up, made a play on the ball. Also disruptive against the run. If teams run at him, he'll drive his man into the backfield, get early penetration to disrupt the running back, force him wide. And then Young will also get aggressive on the zone reads, pinching down, but still showing the ability to get outside and make a play on the quarterback. If teams run away from him, then he uses that speed to chase down the ball carriers from the backside. Teams have to design their game plan around trying to neutralize Young, and often trying to use his aggressiveness on the field against him. But, buyer beware, with that strategy. And so obviously, number 1, Cincinnati, they're going to take Joe Burrow. They need their quarterback of the future for Zach Taylor. But any question that Ron Rivera and Jack Del Rio, any question about what they're going to do with this pick, I think you can throw that out the window. They're going to go ahead and get Chase Young. Washington, not known as a team that really was in need of pass rush help necessarily. They have 46 sacks, 10th in the league. Matt Ioannidis led the way with 8.5 sacks. I mean, the defensive end, really an overachiever there. Kid out of Temple. Montez Sweat, teamed up, looked pretty good there as well. 7 sacks as a rookie. Then Ryan Kerrigan, here's the deal. 120 straight games, concussion kept him out of the lineup. Ultimately, a calf injury sent him on IR for the first time. He did manage 5.5 sacks last season, but look, he's 31 years of age. He's going to be an unrestricted free agent. That's really my biggest concern is okay, what's going to happen with him? And really you can't have enough pass rushers. So you have Chase Young, you have Montez Sweat, you have Ryan Kerrigan, Ryan Anderson, Thomas Davis was brought in by Ron Rivera to have that veteran presence. They're probably, going to kick inside, more than likely. They also have John Bostic, Reuben Foster on the roster, but I think you're talking about those guys playing at inside backer. And look, Chase Young, I wouldn't be surprised if he lines up at D end, for a time. They do have Matt Ioannidis. There is Jonathan Allen as well, but there isn't a ton of depth at that defensive end position. So you could potentially see Chase Young, Montez Sweat, Ryan Kerrigan all on the field at the same time, rotating through that defensive end position, allowing them to also play at outside linebacker. You can get really creative with this offense. With this defense, and I think Jack Del Rio is going to take advantage of that depth at that pass rush, the edge rusher position. So Chase Young, we know number 1 defensive end overall. There's no question about that. Who's going to be the number 2 defensive end coming off the board? Is it AJ Epenesa? Is it Yetur Gross-Matos? That's really going to be the biggest question more than anything else. And to me, I think at the end of the day, AJ Epenesa is going to end up being the next guy taken. I don't think it'll be too far off because I actually have them going back-to-back picks. I have Epenesa actually going to Minnesota with the 25th overall pick. When you lose, actually, I thought I had him going there. Where do I actually have Epenesa? I had Epenesa going 25, and I changed that up because I think Minnesota's actually taking Antoine Winfield. So I actually have him going 27 overall to Seattle. And the reason why I have him going to Seattle, Minnesota makes sense because Everson Griffin wasn't there. That's a potential landing spot for Epenesa. But I think in Seattle, the uncertainty with Jadeveon Clowney, what's going to happen there. LJ Collier didn't do much in his rookie season. And this is a team, look, they only had 28 sacks a season ago. That's when you brought in Clowney and you had Ziggy Ansah on the roster and they still couldn't pressure the quarterback. You bring in Bruce Irvin. He had success there in Seattle when he first came into the league, and we'll see if he can do that again for them. It's really going to be interesting to see how everything plays out. Epenesa, this is a guy really, was a 5-star prospect coming to Iowa City. I think it was the highest ranked prospect there for the Iowa Hawkeyes. In 2018, he really had his breakout season, backing up Anthony Nelson and Parker Hesse, still managed to lead the Big Ten in sacks with 10.5. As a junior, slow start, no doubt about that. People were worried, managed just 3.5 sacks in his first 8 games, poured it on with that production to close out the season when it counted, with 10.5 sacks. 10.5 sacks to finish out the year. What's concerning is when you do watch him play, this is a guy who's very, very stiff at times. The hips, some stiffness there, especially when he's trying to turn the corner. The 5.04 at the combine didn't do him any favors as well. So if you're looking for that lightning quick edge rusher coming off the end, he's definitely not your guy. But he's going to bring you technique. He's going to bring you power. He's going to bring you excellent hands and a motor that never quits. And put on that game of the Holiday Bowl against USC, and you'll see what I'm talking about. This was a guy that when Austin Jackson beat him with speed, he was neutralized. But if AJ Epenesa could win off the ball with his hands and some of that power, then he was creating that soft edge, was making it very difficult for Keaton Slovis. Ultimately knocked him from the game on a strip sack. So Epenesa, I think Seattle, that makes a ton of sense to me. And then you just go a couple of picks later to number 29 overall, and I've got the Titans taking Yetur Gross-Matos out of Penn State, the big, imposing 6'5", 266-pounder. What I really like here is, obviously Harold Landry had 9 sacks a season ago. Vic Beasley signed to a 1-year, $9.5 million contract, but it feels like he's a 1-year rental. Mike Vrabel wants a guy who's going to be versatile. Gross-Matos can line up on the outside. He can line up inside, put his hand in the dirt. Whatever you need him to do, this guy's going to be able to do it. Not only does he have the size, he's got an 82 and a quarter inch wingspan as well, that he really uses that length to his advantage. You see that punch, keeping the offensive lineman at bay, although that punch sometimes is lacking, which will allow the tackle to get his hands into his frame. Does use a variety of rips and swims to win inside. Shows a good counter spin move to get back outside to the quarterback as they flee the pocket. Will allow his pad level to get too high at times. That's going to limit some of his effectiveness. If he can keep that pad level down, he can be very explosive. Hands, like I said, inconsistent, but when he does connect, that violent punch is going to jolt that offensive lineman. Then he locks out those long arms to drive his man into the backfield. That's really what is going to be his game. And I think you add some of his power and some of that explosiveness to go along with Harold Landry. He's a guy that can end up on the field. You can have Jeffrey Simmons play the 3 technique. And I think Gross-Matos, with his size, he could probably end up playing the five technique with Vic Beasley and Harold Landry coming off the edge. And then if either of those guys take a break, you can always then move Gross-Matos outside, let him stand up and rush the passer, playing in space. He has that versatility to be able to do that, tremendous length. I think he's a guy that is going to surprise some people with just how explosive he can be. Look, 20 tackles for loss as a sophomore. Just really incredible, the production, being able to live in opposing backfields like he was able to do. The veteran ability there, 37 and a half tackles for loss in those last 2 seasons. A guy that didn't always get home, but a guy that lived in opposing backfields and was very active. That's one of the things that you can say about Chaisson and Gross-Matos and Epenesa. These guys, you're not going to question their motor. These guys are always working, looking to make a play on the football, and they're never out of a play. If you think you've got them blocked, that's when you're going to get yourself in trouble. If you take things lightly and you kind of relax, that's going to get you in trouble. That's going to get you bit before it's all said and done. So we're going to kind of go through this a little bit. Defensive tackles. The first round defensive tackles, obviously Derrick Brown is going to be our number 1 defensive tackle. There's no doubt about that. Derrick Brown is a man among boys there up front, just dominating the point of attack, especially the last 2 seasons there for that formidable Auburn defensive front. And what I really appreciate about Derrick Brown is, just he's so powerful. The power in his hands it's just ridiculous. That not only the hand, his pop, the violent hands, driving his man back, but you'll see some quick hands as well. He's very quick to dispose of the lineman with a slap and a rip or an arm over to get off the ball in a hurry. You're going to see that quick first step penetration, getting into the backfield, shooting gaps, and sometimes he'll just use his brute strength to just muscle his way through those gaps, converting the speed to power, forcing his way through. Wide base allows him to drop his anchor and hold a point of attack, even against double teams, which you saw frequently throughout his career. Sometimes they throw 3 linemen at him. And that's why I've said before, as a junior, you saw Deshaun Davis, the linebacker, making plays all over the field. Big reason why was all the space that was taken up by Derrick Brown and the multiple blockers that he was taking on as well. A guy, you'll see him manhandling his opponent, using his power to gain leverage before really throwing his man aside. Just kind of throwing him off, like a rag doll before continuing his pursuit of the ball. Power is going to allow him to collapse the pocket from within. Lateral quickness and short area bursts allow him to put pressure on the quarterback. And what's really impressive, like I said, is that nonstop motor. Relentless in pursuit of the ball carrier, known to track the ball from one hash to the opposite sideline, is even going to chase the ball 10 plus yards down the field. Tremendously active, 170 tackles in his career from the defensive tackle position, finished with 33 tackles for loss and 12 and a half sacks as well. A nose for the football, 8 passes breakups as well, forced 5 fumbles. Can play with inconsistent pad level. That's going to allow the blockers to really slow down his rush. Will overextend himself at times, which will affect his balance. But look, this is going to be a high impact starter, a guy who's going to make his presence felt early in his career. If Carolina doesn't take him, then he's not leaving Jacksonville there at number 9. I think Carolina definitely could be on the market for a nose tackle there. They've got a 34 defense that Phil Snow's bringing in. I think Derrick Brown could be that guy. But look, if the Giants don't take Isaiah Simmons, I think Matt Rule needs to take Isaiah Simmons at number 7, gives them a guy that they can build their defense around. We'll talk about Simmons here in just a moment. I think Jacksonville, they need a defensive tackle. They've got Taven Bryan, Avery Jones, really the only dependable defensive tackles on the roster now that Marcel Darius was a cap casualty. Jags, Derrick Brown, I love that pick. Then that's also going to allow the Jaguars to potentially focus on offense, focus on a receiver. I've seen some people talking about the Jags taking Jerry Jeudy or potentially even CeeDee Lamb, Henry Ruggs in the conversation. They do need a receiver. You can get a receiver at number 20. You can't get a defensive tackle with the skills of Derrick Brown, right there. But if there are other teams that are out there on the market for a defensive tackle, and you're looking at him, looking at getting him in round number 1, the guy, absolutely is going to be Javon Kinlaw, 6'5", 324 out of South Carolina. This is a guy who can absolutely collapse the pocket from within. What's crazy is he became an instant contributor there for South Carolina as a sophomore in 2017, shed 40 pounds, became tremendously athletic, was the team's defensive MVP in 2018, racked up 9 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, dominant as ever as a senior. Had 6 sacks on the year, first team All-American, very powerfully built, intimidating presence. This is a guy that you really want, off the bus or out of the locker room first. Very quick first step, uses that to get early penetration off the snap, muscles his way through through gaps, often powering through double teams to collapse the pocket from within. Another guy who has that powerful punch, uses a club or rip move to beat his man. Got him off balance, so he's able to really use his hands to his advantage. Virtually unblockable at the Senior Bowl. I mean, for his, you watch the tape, but the Senior Bowl was absolutely ridiculous. Showing the combination of power and speed to win at the point of attack, repeatedly beating Clemson guard John Simpson, one of the better and more physical interior linemen in this draft, either by driving him back with a ferocious bull rush or using his quickness to beat him off the ball. Strength allows him to bench press the interior lineman and then get off the block to disrupt the run play. For as dominant as Kinlaw can be, any of the momentum is going to be neutralized when that pad level gets too high. He's got the same issue that Derrick Brown has. I mean, when they're 6'5" interior linemen, you got to watch out for that. That's one of the things that Aaron Donald, the lack of ideal size for the position actually works to his advantage, because he doesn't have to worry about that giant target when he doesn't necessarily, if he pops out of his stance, he's still much lower coming off the ball than these guys. I think he needs to work on his technique a little bit and the pad level at the next level to be consistent, but he has the athletic skill set to really wreak havoc as an interior lineman. And where is he going to go? There's a chance that if Isaiah Simmons is off the board, Derrick Brown goes to the Carolina, then I think Kinlaw can end up going number 9 overall to the Jags. But what's going to be interesting is Atlanta, Dan Quinn, Thomas Dimitroff, they're looking to trade up. I think some people think they're going to try to go after CJ Henderson, but look, and I've heard some people say, well, they're going to go ahead and take K'Lavon Chaisson, and I thought that for a while, but you've got Takk McKinley. You still need to figure out what you got there. He's got another year. His future in Atlanta beyond 2020 is in doubt, but you brought in Dante Fowler, had that 11 and a half sack season with the Rams, clearly his best as a pro, so maybe he's really looking to build upon what he did that past season. Vic Beasley's no longer on the roster. Could they go with a pass rusher there? I think that's a possibility, but I think when you really get a pass rusher from within, you team Kinlaw with Grady Jarrett, there's really nobody else on that roster, behind, or next to Grady Jarrett, because Tyler Davison, he was re-signed, but he's more of a run stuffer, and Deidre Sanat, battling some injuries, limits his effectiveness. So I really think that Javon Kinlaw is going to be that guy. So I mentioned that we're going to take a look at the linebackers as well. So why not? Let's go ahead and take a look at our first round linebackers. And I mentioned Isaiah Simmons. Look, the jack of all trades, outside linebacker there for the Clemson Tigers. We've talked about him, quite a bit. And here's the deal. If you look at what Pro Football Focus says about him, it's really staggering. So this past season, Simmons saw the field on 738 defensive plays and lined up along the defensive line for 106 of those, 239 in the box as a linebacker, 256 as a slot corner, 7 as a boundary corner, and 130 as a deep safety. Played in multitude of positions, and filled up the stat sheet in 2019. 104 tackles, 16 going for loss, 8 sacks, 3 interceptions, 8 pass breakups, 2 forced fumbles, and a partridge in a pear tree. This guy's an athletic freak, put on a show at the combine, ran a blazing 4.39 40, 39-inch vertical leap while measuring in at 6'4" and 238 pounds. Remember, he was a converted safety, but he's bulked up now, and he's a big linebacker. Ability to play all over the field was on display against South Carolina. I keep talking about this game. I feel like I keep talking about and hyping up this play. But he lined up against a shifty and speedy Shi Smith as a slot receiver, initially beaten to the outside, but he had the recovery speed with inside leverage to make up the ground, got his head around and tracked the ball, made a leaping play on the football. Lined up at deep safety against Ohio State, showed off tremendous closing speed to come over the top to undercut the route of Benjamin Victor to the sideline for a dynamic interception. And against LSU in the national title game, stayed on the ball side hip of Thaddeus Moss, dove in front of the tight end to make a play on the ball. There you go. In terms of coverage, 3 different impact plays, over the top at safety, covering a slot receiver, covered a tight end, showed a little bit of that. Flexibility to run the arc off the edge to rush the passer, also timing his blitzes, shooting downhill to shoot through the A-gap from depth. Can shoot into the backfield, chase down running backs from behind. Very explosive player. And like I said, if the Giants don't take him, and the Giants, they need a linebacker. Look, Alec Ogletree struggled to cover tight ends and running backs. And you look at the talent that the Giants are going to have to face at the tight end position, you have to consider Isaiah Simmons there. If he doesn't go there, then I think Carolina, when you lose a guy like Luke Kuechly, averaged 137 tackles a game while also racking up 18 interceptions in his career, 12 and a half sacks, 7 forced fumbles in just 8 seasons with the Panthers. AP Defensive Player of the Year in 2019. In 2013. And a guy, look, 5-time first-team All-Pro, 7-time Pro Bowler. To me, when I look at Luke Kuechly, obviously a first-ballot Hall of Famer, a guy who was the heart and soul of that team, not just the defense, heart and soul of the team, in my opinion. No offense to Cam Newton, but this guy, he came to play, and he was. And really no offense to Christian McCaffrey either. I think Luke Kuechly was the heartbeat of that defense. And so you really have to find a way to build your defense around another player. And I think Isaiah Simmons can be that guy for Carolina. So looking at the outside linebacker, staying there, we're kind of bounce back and forth between the outside and inside backers. I mentioned K'Lavon Chaisson. He could end up going to Atlanta, but I think ultimately his home could end up being in Dallas. And the reason being is Dallas needs to really focus on that pass rush, in my opinion. You lose Robert Quinn and Michael Bennett, 2 of the team's top 3 sack artists from a season ago. Need to use that early pick on an edge rusher. Tyrone Crawford is only under contract through 2020. The only other edge rushers on the roster, DeMarcus Lawrence, Dorrance Armstrong, and Joe Jackson. They did sign Gerald McCoy and Dontari Poe along the interior of the line. They need an edge rusher. I think K'Lavon Chaisson will give them some of that versatility. Did end up tearing his ACL in 2018 in the season opener when everyone was expecting him to really have that big boom and that big pop. But look, as a junior, showed that he was back to his regular self. 13 and a half tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, while also recording 60 tackles as the edge rusher. Wins with his hands, slapping the offensive tackle's hands away, ripping through, flattening out to chase after the quarterback. Spin moves, very compact and quick, can change directions in a hurry without any wasted movement. Does tend to let the offensive tackle attack his body, which will make it difficult for him to disengage. But when he gets his hands on the offensive tackle first, he can convert that speed to power with an impressive bull rush. Has a really awesome long arm, driving the offensive lineman back and then able to disengage and get off that block. So even when he's not actually getting home and dropping the quarterback for a sack, he's affecting the plays. And that's one of the things that I think really shows up well. When you watched LSU take on Georgia in the SEC championship, Chaisson taking on one of the top 4 tackles in the draft, and Andrew Thomas, and more than held his own. Look, he won with his explosiveness. On one play, started up the field, got Thomas leaning, spin back to the inside with a low center of gravity to sack Jake Fromm. On another play, use that speed coming off the edge to beat Thomas. And look, the big offensive tackle couldn't even get his hands on Chaisson. But when he let Thomas engage and get his hands on him, he was easily driven away from the pocket. Does have a nonstop motor, relentless in his pursuit of the ball. In that college football playoff title game against Clemson, he fell down, got up, beat the left tackle Jackson Carman inside to hit Trevor Lawrence, forcing a throw well before Lawrence wanted to throw it. He has the speed, he has the explosiveness, a guy who can also set the edge against the run. I've mentioned that he reminds me a lot of Barkevious Kiki Mingo with some of his measurables, but for me, he wasn't as productive as Kiki Mingo at LSU. But I think he's going to end up being a much better pro, and I think the Cowboys snatch him up there. I think that makes perfect sense. And we're going to kick to the inside linebacker position at number 21, the Eagles. Haven't drafted a linebacker since 1979. And what's crazy is a season ago, the 3 starters coming into the year, Nigel Bradham, Zach Brown, and Kamu Hill, all no longer on the roster. So the team traded for Jannard Avery, and they have Duke Riley, Nate Gary, look, an overachiever from the practice squad, TJ Edwards, undrafted free agent, struggles in space. They're desperate for speed in the middle. And I think ultimately this is where Kenneth Murray goes. Look, Kenneth Murray, the athleticism is tremendous, flies around to the football. He can be a 3-down linebacker, perfect match for what the Eagles are going to want to do on defense. Racked up over 300 tackles in just 3 seasons at OU. Sideline to sideline speed, ability to penetrate the line of scrimmage, has the athleticism to run with any tight end in the league. Ran a 4.52 40 at the combine, 38-inch vertical leap, broad jump of 10 foot 9 inches before a hamstring ended his day. But the post-combine workouts have been ridiculous. He's running in the 4.4s, and he's 6'2", 241 pounds, chiseled physique. This guy's a freakish athlete. His biggest issue, is the fact that he struggled with gap integrity throughout his career against the run, often finding himself out of position, over pursuing plays, and giving up big yards in the process. Didn't always take the greatest angles to footballs as well. Ultra aggressive, has a penchant for making plays, not only gets himself out of position, he'll get fooled sometimes, and that's what, he'll often take bad angles as a result. Some of that lack of recognition makes you worry about him playing inside, but I think what's really promising is under 1 year under new Sooner defensive coordinator Alex Grinch, he was able to develop so much and all this growth that I think he's just going to continue to do that. And look, the Eagles need an athletic specimen in the middle of their defense, and I think Kenneth Murray can be that guy. 23, the Patriots. Look, the Patriots are going to take an edge rusher, in my opinion. You can talk about a bunch of other positions, but when you lose, 47 sacks, good for 7th in the league, but much of that production came from Jamie Collins with 7. Kyle Van Noy had 6.5, and Danny Shelton, the nose tackle, with 3. All 3 of those guys are no longer on the roster. And I think Zach Bond had a breakout 2019, 12.5 sacks. Seems like the right fit for Coach Belichick. A versatile player, a guy who can play off the ball, can drop into coverage. Pretty explosive, 4.65 40 at the combine. Also 24 reps at 225 in the bench press, which was good for 3rd highest among the linebackers. But he's very smooth, very fluid. A guy who can drop into coverage, can cover those tight ends. He did have a drug test that was flagged for being diluted, though his reasoning was that he had some excess water intake, trying to add weight to tip the scales a little bit further. I think this is a guy who, he bends well coming off the edge. Definite pass rush ability, has a quick spin move back to the inside. When he flattens out to the quarterback, relentless in his pursuit of the passer, nonstop motor will be a welcome addition to this underachieving defense. I like the pick. I think, Zach Bond can end up being the guy there. Kicking back in or moving back inside, going inside and out and back in. Patrick Queen. I've got him penciled in as my number 2 inside linebacker, the 6', 229 pounder out of LSU, the junior look. This is a guy who it was really surprising. Every time you put the game film on and you wanted to watch somebody else, whether it was Jacob Phillips on that defense, if you're looking at linebacker, if you're looking at the corner with Christian Fulton, Derrick Stingley, the freshman, and Grant Delpit, Clavin Chaisson. Number 8 always seemed to flash, making plays, always ended up around the football. He was a one-year starter, but that athleticism, the physicality, playmaking ability, reminiscent of guys like Devin White, Quan Alexander, Deion Jones, all of whom are having success at the next level. He started the season, he kind of looked out of place, taking poor angles to the football, but by the end of the season, super confident inside linebacker, always seemed to be in position to make a play. In fact, his postseason performance against in the SEC championship and in the college football playoff were tremendous. 22 of his 84 tackles registered in those games, 5.5 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks against Georgia, Oklahoma, and Clemson. Those were his best games. And his last collegiate performance ended with Queen being named the defensive player of the game in LSU's win over Clemson in the title game. Tremendous speed, ran a 4.5 40 at the combine, which was third fastest among all of the linebackers. Has that athleticism to be an off-ball outside linebacker if you wanted to move him around a little bit. And I look at the Saints. I think the Saints, everyone's talking about them potentially be on the market for a wide receiver, and I think that's absolutely true. Michael Thomas needs some help. But they brought in Emmanuel Sanders. I think that can temper it just a little bit, allowing them to then focus on the linebacker position. You lose A.J. Klein. He left for Buffalo. Stephon Anthony and Manti Te'o are both unrestricted free agents. You do have all-pro Demario Davis. He led the Saints with 111 tackles a season ago with 4 sacks and had 9 hits on the quarterback last year. You have Kiko Alonso restructured his deal, but both of those guys are entering the final year of their contracts. I think Patrick Queen, new age linebacker, a guy that has tremendous range. I think that makes a ton of sense for the Saints. I think they really, if they can address that defense a little bit, I think they'll be better off for it. So those are the ends, defensive linemen, and linebackers that I have coming off the board just in round number 1. And I think, you've got some playmakers there, some guys that have exceptional ability and can make plays, all over the field. And it's really going to be fun to see where these guys go, where they come off the board. Round 2, I actually don't have a defensive end coming off the board in round 2. I think, at the defensive end position, this is an area where I think round 3 and round 4, you're really going to see guys come off the board. You're going to see a lot of guys, that's where Curtis Weaver, James Lynch, Alex Highsmith, Jabari Zuniga, Bradley and Raekwon Davis. We're going to talk about all those guys. I think that's where you're going to see them come off the board. But I think defensive tackle and the linebacker position, you're going to see a few guys that will come off the board there. So we're going to go ahead and focus on those guys a little bit. So the first guy that we're going to talk about is Justin Madubuike out of Texas A&M. 6'3", 293, a big, powerful dude, and surprisingly athletic. If you watched him at the combine, he kind of blew you away. Ran a sub 5.40 there at the combine. It was a 4.83, also put up 225 31 times. And, this is a guy who's going to get that penetration into the backfield, whether it's with the brute strength. He has tremendous upper body strength, and he's going to look to try to overpower you at the point of attack. He can work on some of his anchor a little bit. I think he's got to, hit the weight room a little bit with the legs, get, really be able to drop that center of gravity, drop those hips, drop the butt, and really anchor. But definitely can be explosive, can drive guys into the backfield, disrupt the run play, offers a little bit of that short area explosiveness to be a pass rusher as well. I've got him coming off the board, round 2 to the Lions, number 35 overall. I think the Lions losing A'Shawn Robinson definitely hurts. I think that's a guy that can fill in there. Ross Blacklock, 6'3", 290 out of TCU, the junior, a twitched up dude. You watch this guy, he's able to bend around interior linemen, fires so quick off the ball. These guys are unable to get their hands on him, and he's able to turn the corner in a hurry. Very twitched up. I'm looking at Cleveland, and I'm looking at Larry Ogunjobi is only under contract for another season. And he's really the one guy there on the interior of that line, though, that's really been making an impact. I look at Sheldon Richardson. I think Richardson's kind of a part-time, well, I wouldn't say part-time, but a stopgap there, if you will. He is signed through the 2021 season, but a 3-year, $37 million contract. I don't know that that's going to keep him on the roster, past this season. I think he could potentially be a cap casualty next year. So I think adding a defensive tackle and getting Ross Blacklock would make a lot of sense. I mean, look, with Blacklock at TCU, played it, just 2 seasons there for the Horned Frogs, but this past season, 40 tackles, 9 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks. A guy that can definitely shoot some gaps and be disruptive in the backfield. So, I think he's a nice fit there with the Browns. Moving on from there, at the defensive tackle position, you're looking at Marlon Davidson. I've got him going to Green Bay. Now, Marlon Davidson's one of those athletes, look, 6'3", 303, really showed up. He was playing under 300 pounds at Auburn, bulked up, and showed that he can still be just as athletic, being that big. Ran a 5.0440 at the combine despite weighing over 300 pounds. He's a guy that, he didn't always fill the stat sheet, but he didn't always need to. There at Auburn, I think that was one of the things that was just remarkable about that defense is, these guys, they all kind of fed off of each other and they were all winning. I think during the season, he weighed in at 6'3", 278, shows up at the combine over 300 pounds. This guy can absolutely be a 5 technique in a 34 defense. 174 tackles, 28 for going for loss, including 11.5 this past season, 14.5 sacks, including 6.5 this past season, 9 pass breakups. This is a guy who can get after the quarterback, very effective coming off the edge, can set the edge against the run as well. And I think that's something that Green Bay, right now, your starting defensive ends are Dean Lowry and Tyler Lancaster. They need to get a guy there. They've got Kenny Clark there in the middle. They need to find somebody at defensive end. And I think Marlon Davidson would be a nice find there for Green Bay there in round number 2. And then finally, I'm going to give you one more name at defensive tackle. I think Seattle is going to look at Jordan Elliott, 6'4", 302. This is a guy, he's pretty explosive coming off the football, and I think everyone really remembers as a sophomore, he had a 3-sack game from the defensive end position, just looked really dominant at times at the position, coming in, shooting the gaps, showing off, really exceptional speed coming off the ball. And I'm looking at Seattle. I think they need to get some help there at the defensive tackle position. I think really what the biggest thing is you have Jaron Reed coming back. That was a big signing for them. And they need some help outside of him at the position. I think that's really what you're going to see. And I think getting him at the end of round number 2, that's going to be a nice pickup there for Seattle. I think Seattle will be putting together a pretty nice draft overall. You've got Nazir Jones, DeMarcus Christmas. I really like Poona Ford. He's going to be a free agent at the end of the season, and undrafted free agent, a guy that's really can play that nose and be difficult to handle at times because he does have some pretty good quickness coming off the ball as well. So I really like that pick there in round number 2. If we look at the linebackers, we're going to go ahead and transition. And linebacker position, I've got Julian Okwara of Notre Dame going to the Bills at number 54 overall, 6'4", 252 pounds. Now look, with Julian Okwara, he was a defensive end there, playing opposite Khalid Kareem for the Fighting Irish. And Julian Okwara, he's more of the speed rusher. His brother was kind of more of the power guy, the strength coming off the edge. And what I really appreciated about Julian Okwara, was he was very productive as an edge rusher. Now, again, had the season-ending injury and knocked him out in 2019. This is a guy, look, through 9 games, had 7 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, but it was the quarterback pressures. He always seemed to be in the backfield and affecting the play. 24 total tackles for loss, 15 and a half sacks. And look, he's 6'5", 250 pounds. Scratch that. He was actually trying to play catch up here with my computer. 6'4", 252 pounds, over 34-inch arms, put up 225, 27 times in the bench press as well. I think he's a guy, when he gets healthy, the Bills are going to need a guy that's going to be able to come off the edge, and I think this can definitely be the guy to do it for them. Moving on at the linebacker position, Terrell Lewis. I think Kansas City needs to find another edge rusher to pair with Frank Clark. Terrell Lewis, there's a chance. Look, KC's drafting at 63. Terrell Lewis could end up being a first rounder, and that's potentially who KC could end up taking at 32 overall, especially if Yetur Gross-Matos is not on the board. 6'5", 262 pounds, coming off a leg injury. Tore his ACL in the first game there for Alabama. I believe it was against Louisville. And what Terrell Lewis ended up doing, coming back, and he looked like a situational pass rusher. Wasn't a guy who started, but 11 and a half tackles for loss, 6 sacks. Reminds you a lot of Clavin Chaisson because of their, the size, his ability to attack from within, and also looping around as an edge rusher. There were times where he was virtually unblockable, and so that's something that I look at for KC. This is a guy who could potentially go to Baltimore. I think Atlanta would be interested in him. I think New England, as looking for another pass rusher. I think this could potentially be a guy. If Zach Bond is not their answer at 23, you could potentially be looking at Terrell Lewis coming off the board at number 23 overall. I think that's absolutely a possibility, especially if there's any question with that drug sample. You could potentially see Terrell Lewis go 23 overall. I'm looking more so, in terms of the best fit. And at that point, I thought KC was going to be a nice fit there in round 2. It just so happened that they're drafting at number 63 overall. I think KC is going to ultimately trade up for him. Inside backers in round number 2, I got one. And that's Jordan Brooks out of Texas Tech. He's cleared. He's finally healthy. 6 foot, 245 pounds. And a guy who, I think not many people are really talking about Jordan Brooks, but a guy who he can make plays. He's a 3-down linebacker and a guy who he always seems to be around the football. This past season, 108 tackles through 11 games, 20 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, really stepped up his game and really was the leader of that defense for Matt Wells in his first season in Lubbock. And, 66 solo tackles. So, I think, and even as a freshman, 61 solo tackles. This guy, knows for the ball, very instinctive player and a smooth athlete. I really like Jordan Brooks. I think, this is a guy that should come off the board in round 2. And I think there are a number of teams that are in that round 2 area. Look, he ran a 4.5, 4.40, which was one of the faster times at that linebacker position. So where do I have Jordan Brooks going? He could go to the Rams potentially, but I actually have him going to Baltimore. Look, Baltimore, when you have Patrick Onwuasor and you had, Josh Bynes, neither one of them are on the roster. So you're really, you're kind of in desperation mode at the inside backer position. And if you can't get either Patrick Queen or Kenneth Murray in round number 1, then you really have to make sure that you are getting a guy in round 2. And I really like Jordan Brooks. I think he's an ascending guy. And, look, they signed Jake Ryan as a free agent, brought him in on a 1-year deal. Ataru Alaka, LJ Ford at inside backer, Chris Board could potentially play inside as well. Simply put, they've got to address that inside backer position. And I think that's really what you're going to see there in round number 2. Again, unless Kenneth Murray or Patrick Queen happen to fall, they could potentially trade up to land one of those 2 guys, try to get ahead of some of these players, but they're going to have to get up pretty high in order to land them, and that might be a little bit of a stretch. We'll see what happens there. So Moving on, we'll take a look at round number 3. So we're going to go ahead and continue this. I kind of like how we're doing this, going through round by round, taking a look at these positions, position players, and kind of going from there. I think the Jets at 68, if Curtis Weaver's still on the board, I think it would be a steal to get him. 6'2", 265. And when I look at some of his measurables, he reminds me a lot of Derrick Barnett. But I thought Barnett played much better against the run. That said, Curtis Weaver was one of the most productive pass rushers. I think he has a nice repertoire, as a pass rusher. There were times where he would kind of disappear on some plays. Just 52 tackles this past season as a linebacker, still learning the position, started his career as a defensive end. But look, 47 and a half tackles for loss, 34 sacks. This past season, 19 and a half tackles for loss, 13 and a half sacks. 6 pass breakups in his career, 3 forced fumbles. A guy who he could be a situational pass rush guy early on in his career. But if you're talking about the New York Football Jets, to steal a line from Chris Berman, he normally calls that the Giants, but talking about the Jets, that outside linebacker position, I've been talking about them potentially doubling up at the position, and I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen. You do have Jordan Jenkins, and then you have Terrell Basham. They're both only under contract through 2020, the 2020 season. You got to get a pass rusher. I think that's ultimately what you're going to see happen here. Blake Cashman is a guy who's probably going to end up playing inside with CJ Mosley. So we'll see what happens, but I really like this pick for the Jets. Moving on from there, if I can get back to my round 3, there we go. James Lynch out of Baylor. Carolina is drafting at number 69 overall, and Big Lynch, 6'4", 289, the junior. This is a guy, I liken him a little bit to J.J. Watt. He's not as athletic or as explosive as J.J. Watt, but look, here's what I think reminds me so much of him is just his ability when he fires off the ball. For a guy his size, he can bend really well coming off the edge. You're surprised to see just how his ability to sink his hips and turn the corner in a hurry, dipping that inside shoulder and really getting around that offensive lineman, hugging that turn and flattening out and getting to the quarterback. 33 tackles for loss and 20 sacks in his career, but really it was that 2019 season. 19 and a half tackles for loss, 13 and a half sacks, 5 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. Matt Rule was his college head coach there at Baylor. He's now in Carolina, and I think there is a need at the defensive end position. This was the guy that he really went after first at Baylor when he came to the Baylor Bears. And, this was a guy that really stuck it out with Matt Rule to resurrect this program. And I think because of what James Lynch has done, I think there's going to be that connection with Matt Rule, and I think Matt's going to try to get him on Carolina, play opposite K'Wan Short. They did bring in Stephen Weatherly as well. I think that gives them a nice little group, trio there at the defensive end position. Look, he's not going to be the most explosive guy in terms of that speed, but a guy who's just going to outwork you coming off the edge. And I think as a 34 defensive end, that 5 technique, I think he can really shine at the next level. I also think when I think of him, I think of Aaron Smith, the guy that played for a lot of years there at Pittsburgh with the Steelers. So as we move along and we take a look at the 3rd round, I think the Colts have a need at the nose tackle position. Grover Stewart is the one guy up front for them before they ended up landing DeForest Buckner, who was over 300 pounds. I'm looking at Devon Hamilton, 6'4", 320 pounds out of Ohio State. I think this is a guy who can end up playing the nose for them, and I think can end up actually being really productive. A guy who didn't have to fill the stat sheets because he had so many guys that were playing around him with the Buckeyes. But this past season, 9.5 tackles for loss and 6 sacks as an interior lineman. So when you think about that, he had 28 tackles for loss, 28 total tackles and 6 sacks. So nearly 1 in every 4 tackles was a sack. A guy who can hold the point really well. I think he's somebody that fits what Chris Ballard is looking for, one of those tough, hard-nosed players, and a guy who can be incredibly consistent. I really like that pick there for Indy in round number 3. So After him, I'm looking we'll move back to the linebacker position. And Malik Harrison is a guy who can play inside, he can play outside, 6'3", 234. So I really look at Denver. I think Denver makes a lot of sense. You have Josie Jewell there. You have Todd Davis, but you need a guy who can make some plays. Can cover out of the at the linebacker position, cover tight ends, cover running backs, and I think Malik Harrison can absolutely do that. You look at his stat line, and 75 tackles this past season, 16 and a half going for loss, 3.5 sacks, 4 pass breakups as well. A guy who has pretty good range, trusts his eyes to really see what's going on, can diagnose plays quickly, not a whole lot of wasted movement against the run, can drop into coverage, uses his eyes, to watch the quarterback's eyes, allows him to take him to the football and make a play on the ball as well. I think he's got the right amount of athleticism to be a guy that can play either inside or out. Ran a 4.66 40 at the combine, 36-inch vertical leap, so he has some lower body explosiveness to him as well. I like him in round number 3. Staying at the, I don't know if you call it outside linebacker, defensive end position. I mentioned the Falcons still need to get another edge rusher. How about Alex Highsmith out of Charlotte? With the 49ers, look, he's 6'3", 248 pounds, and he's one of my favorite players in this entire draft. I think this was a guy who really kind of reinvented himself to some degree as a senior. As a junior, I think he really had people take notice because of his 18 and a half tackles for loss, but he only had 3 sacks. This was a guy that was making plays behind the line of scrimmage, but he wasn't getting home after the quarterback. So what does he do? He really ups his game as a senior. 75 tackles for loss, 21 and a half going for loss, but then 15 sacks. Ascending prospect, a guy, only 1 year of that pass rush ability, so that is cause for concern, but I think the athleticism is something that is undeniable at the edge rusher position. And a guy, look, if he's continuing to build upon what he's already laid out there, I think he's somebody to keep an eye out for. And look, ran a 4.7 40, so it's not overly explosive, but also offered a 33-inch vertical leap. I really like Alex Highsmith. I think he's going to go off the board in round 3. Some people think he's going to be a day 3 pick. I don't think so. I think the Falcons, that'd be a nice pickup for them. The Jets, I mentioned that they may double up on the position. I actually have that happening. Josh Uche out of Michigan, 6'1", 245 pounds. When you look at Uche, another guy who can make plays on the football. He can drop into coverage. He can rush the quarterback. Had 8 sacks this past season. A guy who you have to know where he's at. I think he plays really well in space. Had at least 7 sacks in each of the last 2 seasons. I really like Josh Uche. If he can pair with Curtis Weaver there in New York, you have Jordan Jenkins there as well. Only there for 1 year. So I think these could really be the future edge rushers there for the Jets. So I really like that pick in round number 3. Moving on from there, I think the Raiders are going to be on the market for another pass rusher. I think, with Max Crosby, getting that, the 10.5 sacks, and then you had Cleveland Ferrell with 4.5 sacks as well. These were guys that were just, so explosive last year as rookie edge rushers. I'm looking at Alton Robinson out of Syracuse, 6'3", 264 pounds. I think he's somebody who can be very explosive. He just needs to return to that 2018 form. And part of it, I think, was Syracuse. 2018 was their year, under Dino Babers, 17 tackles for loss, 10 sacks. They had Eric Dungy at quarterback. They were really firing on all cylinders. 2019 hits, and they really a down season. And you saw Alton Robinson's production drop by half. I think, what Mayock is looking for, though, Mike Mayock, the GM there, and John Gruden, they're looking for guys who be, versatile, explosive playmakers. And what I like about Alton Robinson is, he does have that explosiveness. 4.69 40, 35.5-inch vertical leap, and then also put up 225 35 times. So a guy that can hold the edge and be powerful at the point of attack. I think his strength is underrated, and if he can show off some of that pass rush ability, much like Max Crosby was able to do there for the Raiders, I think he really has something. So when you talk about Max Crosby, just real quick, 6'5", 265, wasn't overly explosive with his 40 time, 41 tackles for loss, 20 sacks in his career, just to kind of put that a little bit in perspective. And you look at Cleveland Ferrell, Another guy who I think, 50 and a half tackles for loss and 27 sacks in 4 seasons there at Clemson. So you look at the level of production. I don't think that Alton Robinson necessarily meets that. But he's not going to be a starter. He's going to be one of those guys. I think, Mayock is going to look for somebody who can be that explosive situational pass rusher guy that can come in and give these guys a breather. And if he can return to that 2018 form, I think he really has something and could end up being a steal for the Raiders. I'm looking at Logan Wilson. The Rams need an inside linebacker, and Logan Wilson is one of the more underrated linebackers in this year's draft. Look, 6'2", 241 pounds, out of Wyoming. Guy who showed up to the combine. I don't think people were really, didn't really know what to expect. Again, Wyoming, a guy that's playing in the Mountain West Conference. And what does Logan Wilson do? Runs a 4.6, 340. Not overly explosive, 32-inch vertical leap. But when you put on the game film, this is a guy who just happens to always be around the football, whether it was against the run, the pass, rushing the quarterback, always around. Number 30 was going to be in there making plays for the Cowboys. Over 400 tackles in his career, ended up just, 6 tackles shy in 2016 and 1 tackle shy in 2018 from having 4 straight 100 tackle seasons. 34 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 10 interceptions, including 4 this past season, one of which he returned for a touchdown. 14 pass breakups, 5 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, one of which he returned for a touchdown as a freshman. Guy makes plays all over the field. Rams need help at inside linebacker. I really like that pick for the Rams. If we continue the momentum, continue moving along here after Logan Wilson, I'm looking at Bradley Anae and the Bills. I mentioned that they were going to potentially take 1 pass rusher. I think they go ahead and go with another one. And looking at Bradley Anae in round number 3, 6'3", 257. What I like about Anae is he has that physicality, has a nonstop motor. He wins with his hands. Double-digit sacks this past season. Very physical guy. A guy who can play at end. Can be an outside linebacker in a 34 defense. I think the Bills could potentially double up, get another edge rusher, and I kind of like that pick. Cleveland needs linebackers. I think there's no question there. You have Willie Harvey, you have Sione Takitaki, Mac Wilson. I think is a guy that you're going to have at linebacker. When you lose a guy like Joe Schobert, that's really going to hurt your defense, I think. And I think Cleveland's going to look for another linebacker there in round number 4. But in round 3, I'm looking at Akeem Davis-Gaither, 6'1", 224 pounds. And I love the guy's length. I love his range. A guy who's really that new age outside linebacker. And a guy, look, this past season, and really, in 2 seasons, we'll talk about both seasons really for App State. Over 200 tackles, 24 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 15 pass breakups. A guy who trusts his eyes, can get into the court, into the backfield, pressure the quarterback, makes plays behind the line of scrimmage, can play in the box, can also drop and play in space. And I think that's really, that versatility is something that Cleveland could definitely use on defense. So if we move on from Davis-Gaither, staying at the linebacker position, Darrell Taylor out of Tennessee, 6'4", 267 pounds. This is an edge rusher who, has that tremendous speed, a guy that can bend really well. If you put on that game against Alabama, struggled mightily with Jedrick Wills. One of the reasons why I think his pass sets were the best in college football, although Penei Sewell might argue with that. You put on that game film and he just absolutely dominated Taylor. But what Taylor does have is that pass rush ability. He'll be a situational pass rusher early on. 26.5 tackles for loss, 19.5 sacks in his career with the Volunteers, 7 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries as well. It's the speed. He's explosive coming off the edge. He's a guy that can really turn the corner in a hurry and affecting the passer coming off that edge. And I really like him to Houston. I've had him penciled in going to Houston in round number 3 for a while. And when you have Whitney Merciless there at one outside linebacker position, I think you need to find another guy that can rush the quarterback, and that's really an area that makes a lot of sense for me. After moving on from Darrell Taylor, I think the Raiders are going to look linebacker as well. They did bring in Nick Kwiatkowski, and they brought in Corey Littleton at linebacker. they have some versatility at the linebacker position. Kyle Wilber's back, Nicholas Morrow's back, but I think you need to get a guy who can be versatile, can play inside, can play outside. The versatility of Kwiatkowski and Littleton lead me to believe that that's really what Mike Mayock is looking at the linebacker position. This might be a little bit high to take this guy, but I really like Marcus Bailey, man. 6', 235. If you listen to my podcast, this is a guy that I've really been talking up quite a bit. And he's battled injury, this past season, unfortunately. Only played in 2 games in 2019. But you have to look at his play in 2018. This was a guy who was a defensive leader, 115 tackles, 9 going for loss, 6.5 sacks, had an interception, a couple of pass breakups as well. Has 6 total interceptions in his career, 4 as a freshman. This was a guy who really was a pass rusher as well, showed up in as a sophomore with 11 tackles for loss and 7 sacks, was really that leader of that emotional leader, that emotional heartbeat of that Boilermaker defense, with Coach Braum, Tyler Trent, David Blau. This was really a team that everyone could pull for. If you're a college football fan, this was really one of your teams in 2018. 2019, after 2 games, he's out for the year, and that really affected Purdue for the remainder of the season. They didn't have a guy that could be that emotional leader that Marcus Bailey was. I think he's a guy that is underrated. People talking about him in the 4th and 5th round range. If the injuries check out completely with him, I think he's a guy that has to come off the board in round 3, and he just feels like a Mike Mayock pick. Baltimore, I think Baltimore needs another defensive end. I think that's something that definitely feels like that's a must, especially when you lose out on Michael Brockers. And I'm looking at Raekwon Davis. A guy who, after his freshman year, didn't really live up to expectations. I think he's one of those guys. If you listen to my podcast, I talk about production versus potential. This is a guy who's always had the potential, just has never lived up to that. 6'6", 311 pounds, and a guy who can absolutely wreak havoc when he wants to. But pad level was always an issue with him. Always seemed to be getting blocked, and he was a guy that was around the play but wasn't always making it. Just never really was able to live up to those lofty expectations. And really it was his sophomore season in 2017, 69 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks in the final 2 seasons. 102 tackles between the 2 seasons, with 8.5 tackles for loss and just 2 sacks. Really struggled to gain any momentum. And I think this is a guy, if the production had maintained there, he absolutely would have been a 1st-round pick. I think he ends up falling because of that drop in productivity. And I think the Ravens could end up getting a steal if they could get the most out of this guy. Can you motivate him? Can you really get him to make plays out on the field? If you can, you may have something there with Raekwon Davis. I think the Steelers end up getting Neville Gallimore at 102, 6'2", 304. That might be a little late for Neville Gallimore. Look, he was one of those guys that ran the sub 540 at defensive tackle. He's over 300 pounds, runs a 4.79, which you'd think would be the fastest at a defensive tackle position. But he's also in the same draft when Khalil Davis at 6'1", 308 runs a 4.7, 540. I mean, are you kidding me? These guys just running so fast. And he's very explosive off the ball. A guy, 1st step quickness. You're going to see a quick arm over, getting into the backfield, quick penetration. I think, you lose Javon Hargrave there for Pittsburgh. I think this is a guy who can be a 2-gap defender and, can end up holding down the nose and be a very explosive, productive player there for the Steelers. And then Jabari Zuniga at defensive end to round things out. If the Vikings don't end up going with Epenesa in round 1, I think Jabari Zuniga is a nice consolation prize there in round number 3. This is a guy who can rush the passer from within. He lined up at defensive tackle quite often for the Gators, especially when they're going with kind of a NASCAR type package when you have 4 defensive ends in the game. A guy who can also rush the passer off the edge. Only played in 5 games in 2019. A guy who battles injury. If you can keep him on the field, he's tremendously productive getting after the quarterback. 5.5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks in those 5 games. 33 total tackles for loss and 18.5 sacks in his career. I look, I thought Jabari Zuniga, Ja'Kai Polite was the guy who got all the hype a season ago. And I think Jabari Zuniga was the guy that really was more the more productive and the more explosive pass rusher, in my opinion. And I think Jabari Zuniga, when it's all said and done, is going to be the better pro as well. I think he's a guy who fits in. I think he can end up being really a day one starter there in Minnesota. Again, as long as he can stay healthy. And I think that's why he ends up falling to round number 3, would be a steal for the Vikings. And then we're going to go ahead and take a look at round number 4, and then we'll go ahead and call it a podcast. So we'll do a quick run through here. I mentioned, the Florida Gators and the productivity there. The Bengals, I think, are on the market for a defensive end, and I really like Jonathan Greenard, 6'3", 263 pounds, coming from Louisville. A guy who, battled injury there and, ends up transferring to Florida. And when you look at him, 16 tackles for loss and 10 sacks for the Gators, really sharing, coming off the edge with Zuniga. I don't think that he got home quite as often. I think his success rate, really concerned at times with some of his explosiveness, really being able to get off blocks as well. Ran a 4.87 40, not as explosive, has more lateral quickness. I think he's quicker than he's fast. So bending off the edge, but a guy that didn't always get home to the quarterback. So we flush him from the pocket and flush him into some other guys, but not always necessarily the guy that had that explosive burst to actually run down the quarterback. Moving on from that, we look at a linebacker position. Carolina, I mentioned that they were going to be looking at Isaiah Simmons, who could potentially be a middle linebacker, could play on the outside. I think another guy with some versatility is Sean Bradley, a guy, with whom Matt Rule is very familiar. I think Matt Rule, you see him drafting, signing guys that he's familiar with, brought in coaching staff, from Baylor. And this is a kid from Temple, 6'1", 235, another guy who's tremendously athletic. If you watched him at the combine, very smooth performer, ran a 4.51 40 at the combine, and a guy who, again, has that versatility to be able to play inside or out wherever you need him. And I think you pair him up with Isaiah Simmons, and these are some of those new age linebackers, 255 tackles in his career. And that's really, the production in the last 3 seasons with the Owls, 22 tackles for loss, 3 interceptions, 5 pass breakups. So a guy that can drop into coverage, plays around the box really well, shoots a lot of gaps, very quick. He's another one of those guys that, was a single digit performer at Temple. So you know what that means. This guy plays with intensity, plays with heart, plays with passion, and Matt Rule, he knows a thing or two about that, having coached at Temple. So I think this is a guy that was one of the heart and soul players of that defense. And I think he ends up bringing him in there in round number 4. I mentioned the Browns needing an inside linebacker. Willie Gay Jr. out of Mississippi State, 6'1", 243, tremendously explosive at the combine. We'll just say that, 4.46 40, 39.5-inch vertical leap, and a guy who just seemed to, when he did make the season, this is a guy who did get himself into trouble, and that affected, out for 8 games. So there are some concerns, off the field, and are things going to check out? This is a franchise. Look, they ended up bringing in Antonio Callaway, so it doesn't necessarily shy away from some of the off-field issues. Through 5 games, had 28 tackles, 3.5 for loss, an interception, a couple of fumble recoveries. A guy who had an interception that he returned 52 yards for a touchdown as well. He has that sideline to sideline ability, making plays. I thought he looked a little stiff in coverage, but he has that athleticism, has that straight line speed. He's bringing speed to that defense, and I think that's something that Cleveland absolutely desperately needs. But again, that off field has to really check out for him. Otherwise, he may fall off people's draft boards completely. Hey, there's a defensive tackle that gets taken here in the draft. And, 118 Denver Broncos, they have Mike Purcell at nose, but I think, they're going to look at Lecky Fotu, or at least they should. 6'5", 330 pounds, the Utah Ute. Not as explosive, I would say, as Starlo Tulele, but a guy who can make plays in the backfield, both rushing the passer and, with some short area quickness. But he's going to really anchor. This is a guy who was very powerful at the point of attack, takes on multiple blockers. The speed to power is evident with him. You've got Bradley Anae and Francis Bernard making plays all over the field there. Before Bernard, it was Cody Barnett that he was opening holes for, Chase Hansen as well. And I think this is a guy that could potentially end up being that guy in the middle for Denver's defense. Moving through, hey, you know what? The Steelers need an edge rusher. They Bud Dupree was a franchise player. I think they end up needing another edge rusher to team up with TJ Watt. And even if they end up signing Bud Dupree to a long-term deal, they're going to need some depth at the position. And I'm looking at Anthony Jennings, a guy that really doesn't get a whole lot of credit, but when you look at the stats, he made a lot of plays, man. 193 tackles, including 83 this past season. 33 and a half tackles for loss, including 12 and a half this past season. 14 and a half sacks, including 8 this past season. And then 18 pass breakups, had 11 of those in 2018. Tremendously long arms, understands passing lanes. I think that was one of the things that Uchenna Nwosu was really good at. That ended up getting him drafted on day 2 to the Chargers. I think Jennings, what he did, he really saved his best for last, in 2019. And I mentioned the 83 tackles, the 12 and a half tackles for loss, 8 sacks, and 5 pass breakups. This was a guy, Bama, there are a lot of other guys defensively that people talk about. But this guy I thought was a consistent performer, game in, game out, really showed up. You saw 33 making plays coming off the edge. Terrell Lewis with all the explosiveness coming off the edge. He's the guy that people talk about. But I think Anthony Jennings is going to have a productive career at the next level. And the Steelers need an outside linebacker, so I think it's a nice little match there. Arizona, I think, at 3-4 defense, I think Jason Strobridge out of North Carolina is a guy that can end up potentially being that 5 technique, 6'4", 275, played D tackle there, undersized defensive tackle. And so I think ultimately that's going to be the transition. I think what you really see with Jason Strobridge was the athleticism that he displayed at the Combine. And so I think that's not just at the Combine, but at the Senior Bowl as well, showing an ability one-on-one to make some plays, had 22 tackles for loss, had 10 and a half sacks. A guy that people weren't really talking about during the season, really got some momentum, really building in the postseason. And, I really like him coming off the board in round number 4 to Arizona. So just a couple more players, and then we'll have everything round, we'll be able to round everything out after that. Baltimore, I think they need to go with another defensive end. And I have them taking Rashard Lawrence, 6'2", 308, a guy who, isn't the most athletic guy, not always the most productive guy, but a guy who just was a steady performer there at LSU. And I think he's going to be one of those, a depth player there for the Ravens, a guy that's going to get some playing time. And when he's there, he won't be flashy, but he's going to get the job done. Steelers, I think they look inside linebacker. They have Vince Williams there. They have Devin Bush. I think they need another inside linebacker though. Jacob Phillips out of LSU, not going to be the prospect that everyone was thinking he was going to be. I thought Patrick Queen was the guy that really stepped up. That said, Phillips was the leading tackler there at LSU. I think, the instincts aren't always there. He doesn't always, you can see the athleticism. He's able to make plays, move over a couple of holes laterally. So the quickness is absolutely there. Diagnosing plays pretty well. Doesn't always take the right angle to the football. But I think round 4 feels pretty nice, and I think the Steelers get a pretty good athlete there. Green Bay, I think they need another inside linebacker. They do have Oren Burks, and they have Christian Kirksey now. They get better speed at the inside linebacker position. I'm looking at Troy Dye, a guy who could play inside. He could potentially play outside, 6'3", 231 pounds. And with Troy Dye, this is a guy, veteran player, a guy that led the Oregon Ducks coming into a senior season, each of the first 3 years. Let's see, 391 tackles, 41 and a half going for loss, 13 sacks, 5 interceptions, 14 pass breakups, 4 forced fumbles, a fumble return that he returned for a touchdown. Guy who makes plays all over the field. The problem for him more than anything else was I thought that he struggled setting an edge, on the outside, because there were times where he'd end up outside, and he struggled there. I think coming and filling in some of the holes. I thought he struggled there at times. Really, when he was getting behind the line, getting into the line of scrimmage and making plays there, was showing off some of the athleticism. But a lot of those tackles, when you look at that 391, if he wasn't making them around that line of scrimmage, a lot of them were being made 6, 7, 8 yards down the field, really making those running guys down from behind, which is concerning. Is he putting himself in the right position to make a play? And so that for all that productivity, I think this is a guy that has some questions to his game, has some holes, and round number 4 actually makes a lot of sense. I think Green Bay gets the guy. You get him in there with those veterans there on the inside, especially Christian Kirksey, and this is a guy that's going to give you a little bit of speed. Looking at it, I've got, let's see, Jacksonville, I think they need to get an edge rusher. Khalid Kareem is a big physical dude, 6'4", 268 pounds out of Notre Dame. He was kind of the thunder to Julian Okwara's lightning for the Fighting Irish. I think the Dolphins need a defensive end as well. Nick Coe, 6'5", 280, coming out of Auburn. The junior decides to enter the draft after his junior season. Very much an underachiever, more than anything else. Had played in 9 games, 15 tackles, 3 tackles for loss, and that's pretty much it. And a guy that couldn't beat out Big Cat Bryant at the other defensive end position opposite Marlon Davidson. His year was his sophomore year in 2018. In 9 games, 13 and a half tackles for loss and 7 sacks. He was really being counted upon to be that guy to take some of that pressure off of Marlon Davidson, and couldn't take advantage of some of the one-on-one matchups, and kind of had a disappointing junior season. A guy that I really wanted to see come back for one more year, but he ended up entering the draft 4th round. That's probably around the range that he could go. He could end up falling in the draft a little bit as well. So those are our defensive ends, our defensive tackles, and our linebackers. I did say that we're going to go position by position, but as I started looking at this and going through it, I was like, you know what? Let's actually go through and actually take a look at everyone all at once. That's 12 defensive ends that came off the board. Young, Epenesa, Gross-Matos, Weaver, Highsmith, Lynch, Anai, Zuniga, Raekwon Davis, Khalid Kareem, and Alton Robinson. Defensive tackle, and you really have to throw Strobridge into this group, even though he is a 34 defensive end. He's registered as a defensive tackle for the draft. 11 defensive tackles, so Brown and Kinlaw at the top. Then after that, Matabwike, Blacklock, Davidson, Gallimore, and Jordan Elliott. Really, it's Jordan Elliott, then Devon Hamilton, then Neville Gallimore, then Lecky Fotu, Jason Strobridge, and Rashard Lawrence. And then linebackers, outside backers, I actually have 10 coming off the board in the first 4 rounds. Isaiah Simmons, Kalavan Chaisson, and Zach Bond in round 1. Julian Okwara, Terrell Lewis in round 2. And then Curtis Weaver, and I actually mentioned him at defensive end, so he doesn't count in this group of 10. But Akeem Davis-Gaither, Josh Uche, Darrell Taylor, Jonathan Greenard, and Anthony Jennings. And really, Greenard can count as a defensive end. You can kind of swap Weaver and Greenard there if you want to. And then inside backer, I'm actually kind of surprised that when I looked at it all, when it was all said and done, that I had this many inside linebackers coming off the board. But total of 10. So you're talking, Patrick Queen, Kenneth Murray, Logan Wilson, Malik Harrison, Marcus Bailey, and Jordan Brooks. Jordan Brooks actually coming off the board in round 2 ahead of Logan Wilson, Harrison, and Bailey. and then Sean Bradley, Willie Gay, Troy Dye, and Jacob Phillips. So in total, we've covered quite a few players, and I think we're just getting started here with these 4 positions. It's 41 players that we've discussed. We're going to go ahead and take a look at the remainder of this position, these 4 positions, excuse me. I've got quite a few defensive ends that I am expecting to come off the board in round 7, especially Michael Dana, Kendall Coleman, I think are going to come off the board. A lot of guys that are FCS products as well, and a kid from Ferris State. If you remember Zach Seiler, this is a kid who I think could potentially end up having a bigger impact than Seiler has thus far at the NFL level. And then we'll jump into the corners and the safeties. We've got a lot of content that we're going to have to get through in our next podcast if I'm going to be able to put out my final mock draft. But, we're talking 29 corners, and we're talking at the safety position, another 20 safeties. So we'll get through all of them. And like I said, my final podcast before the draft, we'll go through my final first round mock, and we'll go team by team, take a look at things. We may talk a little bit about what I expect to see on day 2. And then after the draft, we'll kind of take a look at how teams did. Did they address all of their needs? Were there some holes that they missed out on? And we'll kind of take things from there. So I hope you've enjoyed the content. I hope everyone is being safe, COVID-19 and everything else. Hope you've been along for the ride all the way from episode 1. If not, if you're new to the podcast, welcome to the program, welcome to the show, welcome to my madness. This is my passion. I enjoy the draft. 20 years of putting together mock drafts. I started when I was in college, and I'm putting them together ever since. And you're ready for the draft.com. Got fired up back in 2014. My wife, really, I think it was 2014, 2015. And my wife really said, look, you've got to get the content out. You got to share it with everybody. And Ready for the Draft podcast was born in 2018, continuing to bring things together. I love talking about the draft. I love talking about the prospects, talking about the team needs, breaking things down, trying to see where everything is going to go when it's all said and done. And you can't predict the trades. That's the one thing you can't predict. So there's going to be a ton of trades, especially, not only day 1, but really day 2 and day 3 is where you're going to see a ton of trades. So it's kind of hard to predict, but it's still a lot of fun to be able to project things. And that's really what we're doing here. Hope you've enjoyed things. Hope you've enjoyed the ride thus far. Got a little bit left to go before we call it quits for the 2020 podcast season. But in any event, have a good week, everyone, and we'll talk soon. In fact, we'll be talking again tomorrow. So for readyforthedraft.com, again, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I've been your host, Gregg Schutze. Take care, everyone, and I am out of here.